Okay, so I'm going to talk today about writing full stack code without repeating yourself. And before I start, how many of you are writing full stack applications? Okay, cool. How many of you are using TypeScript on the backend, like Node.js? Okay, cool. Frontend, what are you using? Of course. So what are you using on the frontend? Are you using React?
React.
How many use React? Show me your hands. Cool. How many use Angular? Cool. Vue, anyone? Cool. Svelte? Okay, Quick? Okay, just making sure. So I'll start with telling you a little bit about myself. So as you can see, this is my desktop. It's a 55-inch TV, and I really enjoy it. I recommend it to anyone. I started like this in 2015, and I'm not looking back. Actually, now this is 127, and on top of it, there's another 27 these days, but that's the only change from this picture. Years ago, I've started the company FireflyMigration with my co-founder, Yoni, who's somewhere around there, yeah, waving his hand, where we've done a lot of .NET projects, enterprise applications, banking, insurance, CRMs, ERPs, huge applications. That's how I came to the lovely Budapest. I've met Tamas. We've done great projects together, and it was a lot of fun. In recent years, I've been focusing on open source projects. I've done some NGO volunteer work. I've wrote an application for food banks that I'm going to talk a little bit about later. And this is my lovely family. And can anyone guess what this is? The logo here on the right, which is probably hidden by this. So this is the logo of my small town, of Even Yehuda, somewhere in the Sharon district of Israel. If you ever come visit, there's a cool merchandise. So as I said, I've worked a lot on enterprise application with a lot of front-end code and back-end code and lots of business logics that I felt was spread around the application. These applications had hundreds of tables and thousands of forms, and business logic such as authorization or validation was spread all across the application. It was very difficult to follow. I ran into dozens of boilerplate code being copied around back and forth, put, post, delete, with all the mistakes and all the vulnerabilities, copied again and again. And I think things should be differently. Okay, so if we look at it, we can see here the product object or entity, the thing that we actually care about. But to actually get it to work, we write a lot of SQL code or any other ORM, Prisma maybe, to get it from the database. We write a lot of routes on our backend. We have controllers behind it that do more things. And in the front end, we have code that reads that data from the backend and translates it into objects. Lots and lots and lots of boilerplate code, where I believe this should be the only piece of code in my application. Everything else should be derived from it. So I also wanted to have sharing of types, of validation, of authorization between the front end and the back end. We use TypeScript on both ends. Why not share almost everything? I didn't want to have vendor locking. Like there's great solutions like Firebase and other similar solutions, but those lock you into their frame of mind. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be a tool in your tool chain, something that you can use, not something that uses you. I didn't like code generation. I don't like boilerplate code. You already got that. And I don't like config files. I believe that my code should be expressed in code that I can refactor, code that I can manage. So with those ideas in mind, we started looking for someone unfortunate enough for us to experiment on. So we wrote a food bank application back in 2018. That in Israel, we have a lot of small food banks, like, every town, every group of people have a food bank where they distribute food to the poor every once in a while. So we created an app using Google APIs and all sorts of stuff that was designed to work for 100, 200 food deliveries, and we were very proud of ourselves. And then COVID came. And when COVID came in Israel in the first lockdown, elderly people weren't allowed to leave their house. So food has to be delivered to their houses by the military and pretty much everyone else. And this application, within a few weeks, went from delivering hundreds of food deliveries to hundreds of thousands of food deliveries. And for us, it was a great test for the scalability of the code, for its ability to adapt and change in a short period of time, because COVID just came in one day. And nobody planned for any of this. And since the army was using it, we also got a lot of cyber tests around it, which make us comfortable that this entire pattern also scales in terms of security. And we got the Presidential Volunteer Award back in 2020 for the usage of this as part of the COVID effort. These days, this application is used by hundreds of NGOs in Israel and some also around the world, in Australia and South Africa and Bulgaria, I think, to deliver 400,000 parcels each year by tens of thousands of volunteers, and it all runs on a $16 server account on Heroku. Okay, so this works. So once we decided that it was good enough, as Nobi said, we wrote documentation. And we wrote documentation and tutorial, and we launched it in a little post on Hacker News back in May. And this is our star chart, which we're very proud of. Please help us. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be a QR, and if you like what you see, take the QR and add a star. Now, remult, that's the name we gave it, and we wanted to play nice with other. We want remult to be a tool in your toolbox, not something that dictates things to you. So it works with any frontend, React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, Quick, or Vanilla.js, any Node.js or Dino backend, anything that uses JavaScript, pretty much any database that you can imagine, and any cloud provider can deploy it. So it limits you in no way. So what's my plan for you today? This is a live coding session, and what I plan to do is take a front-end to-do app written in React and make it into a full-stack application. I'm hoping for 20-25 minutes to get to server-side paging, sorting, filtering, CRUD, validation, application logic, Postgres database, authentication, authorization. If you'll be patient enough, you might actually deploy it to the cloud and you might actually use the app. Sounds reasonable? Okay. So as Linus Torvalds said, let's go to code. So here we have our React app. The first thing that we care about is the task entity. This describes the data object that is used in the apps. Simply a set of tasks that each task has an ID, a title, and whether or not it's completed. So not all of you use React, so I'm going to go through the React code and make sure that everyone follows it. It shouldn't be that complicated. So here we have the list of tasks, which you can see over here. Okay, this is our state of tasks. Here we have the method that is responsible for adding new tasks. We have the title, and we have the add task method. And we can try it and add a task. Here we have the set all completed method that is used by these two buttons to set everything, to completed and not completed. And here we have the HTML, that's the input on top. These are the tasks. These are the set titles, set deleted, everything React wants. So I can set everything as completed and delete whatever I want. Simple enough React code? Okay. And the problem with this code is that it doesn't have any state. Everything is saved in the React state, and that's what we want to change today. So to make this app into a full stack app, the first thing we want to do is we'll add a server to it. So I'm going to give up on my mouse, and I'm going to add a new file called backend/index.ts. And here I'll define const app equals express, just like you do any other Express app. Now, in this environment, I'm using Vite. How many of you use Vite? Okay, so I'll tell you what Vite is. Vite is an amazing tool that helps developers develop faster. It does the bundling, it does the hot reloading, and all of that. It's just like create React app or the Angular CLI, just on steroids and runs very, very fast. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to ask Vite to also run my backend. So to do that, I'm going to export the app here, and I'm going to go to Vite config, and I'm going to say import express from a nice little plugin, and I'll use it over here. I'm going to tell it to take the code from the source backend folder. Now, to see that it actually works, I'm going to go to the index and say console log backend, and I get that here. Cool? Okay. And the next thing we need in an Express application is to listen to a port. Now, of course, we don't need to do that when we're using Vite. So we're going to say if not process env Vite, then app listen 3002. Cool. So now that we have the backend, we'd like to add remult to it to start using it. So I'm going to say import remult express, and I'm going to use remult as a middleware of Express. So that's the setup we need to configure remult to work in our environment. So now, once we have that, let's go back to our code and take a look at the task.ts. The task.ts is a type that's currently used on the front end, and I want to share it between the front end and the back end. I don't want to create two versions of it. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to create a folder called shared, and I'll drag the task and drop it over there. Great. So now we have that shared between the two. Now, as I said earlier in the PowerPoint, I want this to be the focal point of everything related to a task. I want this to be the single source of truth. I want to derive from it the API, the database, the front-end query code. So to do that, I'm going to give it a decorator called entity, call it tasks. And to expose it to the API, I'm going to say allow API CRUD equals true. Later, we're going to restrict that with authorization, but for now, let's say that everything is allowed. And then I'm going to decorate the fields to give them their proper types. So this is going to be an auto increment, a string, and a Boolean. Okay? So we've configured the task, and we'll add it to the index.ts. We'll register it here. And as soon as we do that, we can see in the console that we have a new route, API tasks. Okay? And yeah, all of you are looking to the side. You are welcome to stand, by the way. So you see the API tasks, and let's test that it works. So I'm going to run a new request. I'm going to say localhost 5173 API tasks, and I get an empty array. Okay, so I get a REST API endpoint that I can use. Let's add some data to it. So I'm going to put here title test, send it, and get an error because I've sent it wrong. Send it now, and cool. The data was submitted. Okay, you can see the response from the post request. Now, at this point of time, we don't yet have a database, so we're using simple JSON files. Later in the demo, we'll replace it by a normal database. But for now, let's have a look at the JSON file, and we can see that the data has been put in. Okay? So we got the endpoints. They support get, put, post, delete. We've tested get and post. Let's add some more tasks there. So let's go to our original task list. I'll take it from the front end, copy it, delete it, and save it. So now we no longer have tasks in the front end. And I'll go back to our nice little Postman competition, add an array, and post it here. And now we have all the data installed. Okay, let's go back to look at our JSON file. And we can see the data was posted. So far, so good? Great. So with this simple piece of work, we were able to define database, at least JSON for now, API endpoints. Now let's go ahead and use the same code in the front end because we want to reuse as much as we can. So I'll switch over to our app.tsx. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to say const task repo equals remult repo of task. Okay? And that will return to me a repository object of type task, which I'll use to interact with the task on the backend. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and add a use effect. For those of you who don't use React, use effect is run when the component is loaded, roughly speaking. And we're going to say here, task repo, find, then set tasks. And as soon as I do that, I get the task from the backend. Let's open the network tab and refresh. And we can see that a REST API call was made to the backend. Okay? And that's how we can reuse the task type both on the backend and on the front end. Now, the find method by default returns all, but we can also tweak it. We can say, for example, limit 3, so we get the top 3 rows. We can then say page 2. And I don't know if you can see it here. I can actually try and make it a little bigger. You can see that this is just a normal, too big, normal REST API call. Okay? So we get server-side paging without having to work on it. It just works. We can also say order by, completed ascending. So the data is sorted ascending or descending. And again, it's all just REST API calls that being sent to the backend. We just didn't have to write a lot of boilerplate repetitive code to get that. Okay, we can also do backend filtering. I can say where completed true. Okay, so I get only the ones that are completed, completed false, and undefined if I don't want to really filter. Cool. So only by defining this task class, okay, making this definition and registering it on the backend, I got database, I got API, I got front-end query language that works full stack, including sorting, filtering, and paging. Let's go ahead and make it CRUD. Let's see if the changes actually apply. So the first thing I want to do is be able to add new tasks. So I'm going to go to the add task here, and I'm going to say await task repo insert of our task. Okay? So I added this nice little piece of code, and as soon as I've done that, my code will support adding a new task. Yeah, if I type on the right place. Yay. So I'm going to say here, a new task, and it was added, and we can see here that a post call was made to the backend. Okay, you can see the post call, and it inserted the task to the backend. Let's go ahead and support deleting a task. So we'll go to the delete task method and say await task repo, delete task. So now if I delete it, we'll get a delete call to the backend, and the task will be deleted. Let's support saving. So I want to, after we set completed, I want to say await task repo, save, task completed. So now when I check the checkbox, it will also send a put request to the backend and save the changes that I've done. Okay? And let's save changes to text. I can say here const save task. And put a try with an alert. So if you get an error, we can see it, and say await task repo, save task. And we'll call it and the on blur of the input. Okay, so now if I edit test123 and leave it, I will get a put call to the backend, and it will save that. Okay, so just by defining this one simple task class with these simple decorators, I got full stack CRUD capabilities that are fully typed end to end. Now, everything that I've shown you so far is production ready, running for many, many years. We love it and we're very proud of it. I'd like to show you something that I'm working on right now, and hopefully you like it as well. So as you can see, we have these tasks over here, but my user said, hey, I have another user who looks at the data, and they've unchecked everything, but the first user still doesn't see it. Okay? Obviously, we take that for granted, but the users don't understand why. They're used to it being synced just by default everywhere and anywhere. And just like someone told me, but Word has undo, why don't you have undo? Or they come up with the answer that Google did it, why can't you? So I want to show you an experimental API we're playing with, and hopefully it will work well. This will be in the next major release of remult. It's coming soon. So previously we've done task repo. This is what I'm going to focus on. We've done task repo find, and then I'm going to change that to task repo query. And instead of then, I'm going to say subscribe. And subscribe returns an unsubscribe method, so I can remove these curly brackets because that's exactly what, incidentally, that's exactly what use effects want. And that's the only change I've made to the code. Instead of making find, and then I'm doing query and subscribe. But now, if I'll go and check these boxes, the other one will get updated instantly. And I can actually drag and drop it here. And we can see that it live updates, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, so let's catch up on what we've done. We can delete the test one because we don't need it. We've done setup, entities, paging, CRUD. We haven't done validation, so let's focus on that. Validation is another one of these concerns that gets spread all across my code. You'll get front-end validations that does one thing, you'll get back-end validations that hopefully does the same thing, but not necessarily so, as all of us have hacked a website or two just by bypassing the front-end validation. And really, it's the same code. Why the hell do we need to write it twice? So if I want to validate, all I need to do is, to the options object that I sent to the decorator of the columns that I care about, I can just say validate, validators required. And as soon as I do that, if I try to enter an empty value, I will get a validation error. Should not be empty. And I'm going to clear the network tab and do that again, and you can see that it's front-end validation. No network call was made. Okay? Now let's go ahead and bypass that. Let's try and call the new request. I'm going to say post, and we're going to try to post a request that is malicious with no data. And I get the same validation working also on the backend. So I define the validation once in my single source of truth in my task, and it works both on the front end and on the back end and making things consistent. And of course, I can make it a more complicated validation. I don't have to use a built-in validation. any arrow function can be used as validation. So I'm going to adjust this to say task, if task title length is less than 3, throw new arrow to short. And as soon as I do that, if I try to update something, I get to short. And if I do the same from the new request, I'll get to short as well. Okay? Cool. So let's see what we've done. We've also done validation. And the one thing we didn't do with our CRUD is the set all. Let's talk about the set all for a second. The way this happens, or the way I like to describe it at least, is my user had a checkbox that he sets manually. And then one day he came to me and said, you know what, I'm too lazy to set it one by one. Please add a button to set them all. Now, I'm a front-end developer, so yeah, that's quite easy. So let's do that. I'm going to say here for a task of await task repo. Fine. And I'm actually running on all the tasks from the backend because maybe I have a filter, maybe I'm not showing something, so I want to do all the tasks. And I'm going to say await task repo, save, task completed. Okay, and as soon as I do that, this functionality works. My user is happy, I'm happy. My boss, not so much. Because he then opens the network tab and tells me, hey, you know what you've done? Imagine if you have 1,000 tasks. This will work very slowly. There are many, many requests. Every one of these tasks gets updated with a put request to the backend, ending up with quite a few requests. And then I say, yeah, okay, no problem. Let's move this code to the backend. So to do that, I'm going to add a folder. I'm going to add a file called, yes, I'm going to add it in the right place, called tasks controller. I'm going to say export class task controller. Okay, and I'm going to copy the method from my front end to that class. And I'm going to change it to be static, async. And it's the same code, but this time I'm going to decorate it with the backend method decorator. The backend method decorator tells remult that when you're about to call this method, instead of running it in the front end, make an API call to the backend to run this method. And just like before, I'm going to define a const task repo, remult repo of task. Okay, so previously, the repository was used in the front end to make API calls to the backend. When I use the same repository on the backend, it will make database calls to the database. If it's Postgres, if it's Mongo, if it's a JSON file. The same abstraction is used both on the front end and backend to work with data, making things portable between the front end and the backend. And all I need to do now is register it in our index.ts. And as soon as I do that, we can see that another endpoint was created. And in the front-end code, all I need to do is, instead of doing this for loop, I will say await, task controller, set all, completed. Okay? And that's it. If I'll clear the network tab and I'll set all completed, we have one call to the backend that does exactly the same work. Okay? So by using the same repository abstraction, both on the front end and the back end, I can take code from the front end, refactor it to the back end, and vice versa. I can have a piece of code that in some cases will run on the front end and in other will run on the back end. I don't need to have two different mental states of front end and back end. So let's recap. We've done setup, entities, paging, CRUD, validation, backend, database. It's about time. So we've been using JSON so far, which is fun for development and I love it. But someone wants me to grow up and use a real database. And that's actually quite easy. All I need to do, in this case, I'm going to use Postgres, but you can really use many, many databases. But I'm going to use Postgres. So I'm going to get remult Postgres. And I'm going to say here, the data provider for remult is create Postgres connection with the connection string that I've prepared in advanced. Okay? As soon as I do that, the server restarts and I have no data because there's no data in Postgres. And we can see that it actually checked the structure and created the table. Of course, this is optional. It's not mandatory that the code will create the tables for me, but I actually am lazy, so I like that. And now I have the data in Postgres. Okay, let's go ahead and post some rows there so we can actually see data. So we're gonna go to this one and undo it until we get the list again. And we're gonna send it, and now we have the rows. Okay, and just to make sure that I'm not joking, we can go here and go to tapes and say, select top 1,000 rows, and we have the rows in our database. Okay, so crossing the items, so we've done setup, entities, paging, CRUD, validation, backend, database. And the last major thing I want to talk about is authentication and authorization. Again, this is a concern that spreads across the code. It's duplicated many times between the front end and the back end. The delete button will only appear for users that are allowed, and the delete HTTP method should only be allowed to users that are allowed. This is a problem that we tackle all the time. And just like anything else, I believe this should be in our single source of truth in our task. So if I only want people who are authenticated to see the task, all I need to do is say allow authenticated. And all CRUD operations will only be allowed to users that are authenticated. And you can see that immediately I got an error here when I was trying to query the tasks because I'm not authenticated. Okay? Now, authentication is something that smarter people than me solve many, many times. You can authenticate via user and password, via Google, via pretty much anything else. And that's the fun thing about remult. It's just a tool in your toolchain. Use whatever you like. Just tell remult who is the user. Okay? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to use, in this demo, a cookie session authentication. So I'm going to run this and recap what we've done. Here I've configured the cookie session middleware for Express. Here I've added a list of users. Of course, in real time, this will be like a database table, but for this demo, this will have to do. And here I'm making an API route, a standard Express API route that authenticates the user and eventually sets the user to the session property. Okay? Again, an advantage of remult, we've seen backend method. I could have done this with a backend method, but I just wanted to show you that you can use a standard Express route and all will work. Now let's tell remult who is the user. So we're going to say here, in the remult Express middleware, I'm going to say get user from the rec session user. Okay, just like we've set the user here, we'll get it here. Okay, cool. And in the front end, instead of just using app, I'm going to use auth around it. And we're going to go through auth's code in a second. So the auth component, I prepared it in advance, just not to waste your time seeing me write an auth component. So it has a sign-in username and current user. It has a sign-in method that makes a fetch call to the Express route that we written before, and sign out, and a few subconscious messages, please give remult a star. So let's see that it works. I'm going to sign in as Steve, and now I can see the data. Okay? And let's make it more interesting. Let's say that Steve can add tasks. Okay, but Steve is not responsible enough to delete tasks. And we believe that Jane is responsible. So let's go to our index.ts. Let's go to our test task first of all, and say that we only allow delete for someone who is an admin. And as soon as we do that, Steve can no longer delete the task. He'll try to delete it, but it will fail, and we'll get the error over here because Steve is not an admin. Now let's go and designate Jane as an admin. So I'm going to say that Jane has the role of an admin. And I'll sign out, sign in as Jane, and Jane can delete. Okay? So as you can see, we were able to centralize, okay, all the different rules, all the different logic, the validation, the authorization, authentication, structure, typing, all of that into our task class, our single source of truth for everything that is related to task. And actually, I forgot about one thing to show you earlier. Remember that we've used the backend method, and we've sent to it the completer parameter over here, where we set all tasks. On the way, we actually got type validation. So if I send string over here, I will get an error. This is also very important, typing between front-end and backend calls to backend RPCs for all sorts of RPCs. Cool, so we've completed pretty much everything I wanted to show you. Do you guys want to see this deployed to the cloud?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So up until a month ago, I've used the Heroku, which are great, but they've stopped having free accounts. Although $5 does make sense for what they give you, but let's try and use someone else. So first of all, let's adjust our code to be ready for production. First thing we need to do is we need to tell the database not to use the connection strings that I'm using here, and instead get the connection string from the database URL environment variable. And next, I'm going to use the same Node.js server also to serve the static files of my React app. I don't want to have two servers because I'm too lazy to do that. So I'm going to say here, serve static files, which actually takes the files that are in the dist folder, that's the result of the build of it, and serve them to the browser when the user asks for them, and also listens on the port that comes from the environment variable. Okay, so once we've made our code production ready, let's go ahead and try to deploy it. So I'm going to say railway init. How many of you have heard of Railway? Cool, I don't know. So Railway, it's a nice little company from the US West Coast that provides managed hosting, which is, they've done a pretty good job. So let's say Budapest.js. It's the name of my project. And they have a nice UI, and they're really doing a good job. And I'm going to say here, please add me a database of type Postgres, and they will go and spin up a database for me. And they have a very nice free plan. They give you like $5 credit, which covers enough to run a server in a database. And the next thing I'm going to say is railway.app, which will upload my server to Railway. Now, to be honest with you, this only works half of the time. So I'm hoping that it will work on my first account, but if it doesn't, I'll either fix it or switch over to Heroku. I hope you'll be patient enough. Now, while it's running and building, let's go over to our slides and just have one more slide. So obviously, Remult has a lot more than what I had the time to talk about today. We support GraphQL and OpenAPI, which makes it fun to query from any technology. There's a full set of entity lifecycle hooks where you can jump in, like before save, after save, deleting, whatever, JSON serialization. You can intervene in many, many places. You just don't have to, which is the way I like to work. I'm lazy. Everything that we defined is also available to us on the front end. So if you want to restrict the delete button to only appear for users who have the delete role, we can get that as well using the metadata. Relation between entity, fields that are only computed on the back end, or fields that are hidden from the front end, like passwords. We can work without decorators if you don't like decorators. We have decoratorless support, and if you like plain JavaScript, it works as well. And as I've shown you earlier, live query is coming soon. Let's go back to this, and hopefully it's finished, and we can try and give it a domain. And once we got the domain, we're going to open Budapest production over here, and it's going to take it another second to load, which I'm going to use to show you how cool the logs are here. So I can look at the deployment, ask it to show me the logs, and we can see in the deploy logs that we got the same text that we previously had in our Vite development environment. And hopefully by now it has loaded. Yes! Okay, so now it's running on the cloud. And I'm hoping all of you are willing to serve as my QA team, because the new live query feature is new, so I need you guys to test it for me. So I'm going to sign in as Steve, and then I'm going to do this and get a nice little QR code and download it and open it and make it huge, and ask you guys to please sign in and start adding tasks. I'm going to add the first one. And please try and add the tasks and maybe update tasks or set all completed or whatever. The user is Steve or Jane, by the way. Yes! I've got the first task from the audience. Someone more, just to make sure that it's not a fluke. Okay. So as you can see, live query, the preview feature actually works. I'm going to jump back to our slides just to finish it off. Do you have any questions so far, or at all?
We're busy creating tasks.
Okay, cool. I like that. I'll be here afterwards for as long as you need me. My flight back is 2 days from now, so I can do whatever you want. So thank you for viewing this presentation. I invite you to our website, remult.dev, where we have tutorials for React, Angular, Vue, and Next, in which you can, within an hour and a half or 2 hours, create an app from scratch, all the way to have it deployed on Heroku with database authentication, authorizations, and everything. Soon we're going to replace tutorials for Railway. We haven't had the time yet. This is our GitHub repo. Please come and give us a star. Please, 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 we love those stars. This is my Twitter handle. This is my email. This is my personal phone number. So if you want to play with remult, just let me know. I love working on these kind of projects. Thank you very much. So I think it's a break now.
We still have some time for some questions. For those of you who have some.
Go ahead.
If you have some kind of exceptions when the database is down, how is that handled? Is there a certain format between the backend and the frontend for exception communication?
Yeah. So any exception would translate to an error message like the one we've seen before. So if you've seen the validation errors that I've done, that's through an exception at the end of the day, and that gets translated and produced to the frontend in a consistent way so that you can later use it in the frontend to display to the users. Okay? Yes?
What is the difference between the client repository for a task and the server repository? Obviously, they seem to be doing vastly different things. One is talking to a database, and the other one is talking to the backend. So is there two different implementations for this, and it just picks the one that it needs?
Exactly. The repository, so I'll just repeat the question for the recording. So what is the difference between the repository implementation on the front end that calls the backend and the repository implementation on the backend that calls the database? So what we've done there, we decided on a set of common tasks that make sense all across the stack. Being able to update, insert, delete, query, page, sort, order by, count, I don't know, a set of common tasks. And then we defined them in an interface, and we created implementation for that interface. One is a front-end implementation that uses the fetch API to call the backend. And on the backend, we have multiple implementations for that, for Postgres database, for Knex, to use pretty much any other database, for Mongo, for JSON. I even created once an implementation for Google Docs to use that as a database. Okay? As soon as you have a consistent database, a consistent interface that you can implement, you can use it in any way you want. So just like that we have those that call the backend and those on the backend, we also have ones for the frontend if you want to use WebSQL to store it offline. So you can use the same repository to work with the offline WebSQL or local storage, or an IndexedDB is coming in the next version. Did that answer your question?
Pretty cool stuff.
Thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Do you use remult for your application, which you mentioned?
Yes. Yes.
So we could see the whole code on the GitHub?
Yes.
That's great.
That's actually a wonderful question. I use remult for anything. I created it for me to use before I created it for anyone else. So I've written many, many apps with it. And the biggest one is the Hagai food distribution app that I've talked about. As I said, it runs on an Heroku server that cost me $16 in total, database and server and everything, and I'm pretty proud of that. All of those repositories are in my repository, in my GitHub account. Just to show you, because I have a few minutes, so I like writing fun applications. So these are on a Heroku free tier, so it takes a second to load, but let's give them a second to load. And I'm going to run, cool. So yeah, this one actually load. Obviously, some of them are in Hebrew, so it's going to be confusing, but it's going to catch up in a second. So you can use remult to write pretty much anything, and it gave me kind of the ability for writing an application in hours. Okay, like I can do within a day or two a complete application to help someone. So I've written a lot of charity apps for charity organization. Like in Israel, we have an organization that takes used computers and fixes them by people with special needs. They fix the computers, and then they deliver those to people, to families of lower means. Okay, so this is like crosses all the lines of charity. And so we've developed an app for them to manage the factory, all the steps where it goes through the workflow and whatever. This is Angular and remult. Most of my applications are Angular and remult. This is an application I've written for my brother-in-law who collects miniature alcohol bottles. Okay, so he took pictures of 2,600 bottles of his collection here. And you can search really using anything. I know, Hungary. And these are the bottles that we have from Hungary. Okay, this was actually very useful for me because last time I was here a month ago, I wanted to buy him a bottle, so I was able to search and see what he doesn't have. And this is an application that's actually in Hebrew, but still may be useful. It's like a bank for my kids. Okay, because I have kids and they have allowances and it gets lost. So there's a small bank, and this already has like 30, 40 families using it. And all of the source code for these projects are available on my GitHub account. And the source code for that I've shown you today, I'm going to upload it later to the meetup also and share it with you guys.
That's what CRM example.
Ah, yes, thank you. So yes, now everything you've seen so far is a nice little game. But at some point we said, okay, let's create something that is a bit bigger than that. And I don't remember exactly where it is, so I'm going to search for it. The GitHub README. Thank you. So this is my GitHub README. This is the star on the top right. If you don't know how to star, you just need to click there. And if I scroll all the way down, we created a full stack to do MVC app. Okay, and you can see the source code here. And I'm going to show you the app itself that runs now on Railway. No, wait, it's not what I wanted. No, sorry, I chose the wrong one. Wait for it, it's coming. CRM demo. So this is a full CRM written with React and MUI on the front end. Still uses CRA, but it will use Vite at some point. And you can just sign in, and if you use the wrong password, it will tell you what to try. And then I'll try it, and I'll sign in. And you can see a full CRM with, a Kanban and drag and drop and all of these. And this is like an example of a larger scale app. And the code for that also, you can get to it as you've seen on our GitHub. And it's right over here, the entire source code. So you can use that. People use that as an example of a larger app and where you can take this. Cool? Any more questions? Okay, cool. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you.